Well, hello and welcome to the Clean Edge webinar on carbon border adjustments. Thanks very much for joining us today and good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Keohane, and I'm the president here at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. We're very pleased to welcome you to the Pricing Carbon Initiative's Fireside Chat with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on his carbon border adjustment bill. So for those of you who are unaware, when C2ES was formed 25 years ago, we also founded the Business Environmental Leadership Council, or the BELC, with the goal of integrating the experience and expertise of the private sector into policy design and advocacy. And we've always been a supporter and a strong advocate of market-based policies like those we're going to discuss today. And our goal is to accelerate the transition to a thriving, just, and resilient net zero economy. We see market-based policies as critical to that. We've also been a member of the steering committee of the Pricing Carbon Initiative since its launch about 10 years ago. And we're delighted to host today's webinar on carbon border adjustments. This may be familiar to folks in the audience, but to make sure we're all on the same level set, carbon border adjustments are an emerging set of trade policy tools that aim to avoid shifts in economic activity from one jurisdiction to another that could lead to higher total greenhouse gas emissions, known as carbon leakage. Carbon border adjustments have moved from theory to practice recently as the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, aims to mirror the carbon price that applies to producers inside the European Union as part of their cap and trade program, and apply that carbon price to a set of mostly imported industrial goods, including steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, and hydrogen. With the adoption of the EU's CBAM mechanism last month, which went into force actually yesterday and will be applied starting this October, there's renewed focus on how this policy might impact US competitiveness and of how the US might take up similar policies itself. Indeed, there's bipartisan interest in a US carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that interest has accelerated as the EU has planned and finalized its own CBAM. While the two parties are likely to have some different interests and design choices, there's a genuine possibility of bipartisan compromise and action. Increasingly, those discussions in the United States have centered around protecting industrial competitiveness by limiting imports of goods that are more carbon intensive than those produced domestically, and reducing the incentives for US businesses to move production abroad. So this is a very timely discussion, and we're particularly pleased to have Senator Sheldon Whitehouse with us. Senator Whitehouse has long been one of the leading champions of carbon pricing and ambitious climate policy in the United States Congress, and has more recently become a leader on the issues of climate and trade as those have become more central. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items very briefly. First, we will be recording this webinar. A recording of the webinar will be made available on our YouTube page within 24 hours. Second, the format of today's webinar will be a fireside chat followed by a panel discussion. Christina DeConcini, the Director of Government Affairs at the World Resources Institute and also the Chair of the Board of the Pricing Carbon Initiative, will conduct the fireside chat with Senator Whitehouse. That will be followed by a Q&A with Matt Bolden, Climate Policy Advisor for the Senator. And we'll then have a panel discussion on carbon border adjustments, moderated by Alden Meyer, Senior Associate at E3G. We'll have time for audience Q&A in each of these sessions. So please submit your questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom, and we'll try to answer them at the very end of each session. With that, let me turn it over to Christina DeConcini. Christina, over to you.
Okay, hi, thank you so much for that, Matt. And I'm just going to jump in here. Senator Whitehouse, if you want to come on, that would be great.
Hi.
Matt did all the introduction that I was going to do that I don't need to do about what a CBAM is, but hopefully the 600 plus people that registered for this webinar have some idea why we're talking about this. But I do just want to say, we cannot say thank you enough, Senator, for your leadership on climate. It's unmatched. That's all there is to it. It's unmatched. Your persistence is unmatched. And now I'm enjoying very much watching you as the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, making very clear how climate is a central budgetary issue because of the economic consequences for it. So anyway, just thank you. And it's really great to see you again. So I'm just going to jump in. We know that you've been talking for a couple years about the coming European CBAM and how the US was going to need to be responding to that. And you've shown a lot of leadership in introducing your bill on that we're going to talk about today. And I just wanted to ask you sort of writ large, how do you think the US will respond, should respond, or what the consequences are going to be on the US when the EU CBAM goes into effect?
It is not yet clear how the US will respond, and there is no central designee in the Biden administration for responding. So that's kind of the first question that needs to be answered. Who's in charge here? Could be a lot of people. Could be Kerry because it's climate, could be EPA because it's environment, could be Treasury because it's revenues, could be the trade rep, Catherine Tai, because it's tradey, could be Treasury for, I mean, there are a lot of people who have a hook into it. And the first thing the Biden administration needs to do is put somebody in charge so a decision gets made. I think that the only sensible decision is to come up with a carbon border tariff of our own that complements the EU's tariff and eliminates the tariff gap between our countries. It makes no sense to just sit here and let ourselves be tariffed when the spur of fixing the tariff problem also helps fix our climate problem. So the good news here is that even if we do nothing, even if the Biden administration doesn't put anybody in charge, even if we don't get any kind of a reciprocal American tariff, the net effect on the economy in the US of the CBAM in the EU is viewed by every expert I've talked to who has a view on the matter as positive. That is that the economic headwinds we sail into of having to pay the tariff for exports into the EU is more than offset by a powerful economic tailwind of the EU shifting production, manufacturing, supply chain from China and other much more highly tariffed economies to ours, because the tariff differential makes that a smart economic decision for them. So it's not like we're going to have a huge economic crash if we don't do this, but it could be an even bigger lift and a big carbon emissions reducer if we pull up our socks and agree to something that offsets the EU CBAM.
Okay, that's great. And that brings me to, it is pretty unique in this Congress, to say the least, to have bipartisan support for something. And we've seen sort of generally that Republicans have not been overly supportive of domestic climate policy, claiming that it will raise prices and it won't make a dent in global. I don't know. I'm just generalizing.
Just generalizing.
Just making, I don't know, a small observation. But this is, and then also because they often will say it won't do enough on global emissions. So there does seem to be that perhaps there's a sweet spot here with this type of policy with bipartisan support, because it doesn't run into those kind of buzzsaws for that part of the party. And we have been briefed on, and it's been in the news a lot that there's going to be a Republican bill forthcoming. But can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective on the inside, of how strong you think the bipartisan support is? Will there be a bill introduced sometime soon? And what you hope for and foresee as the process forward?
Yeah, I would say that there are 4 Republicans who are fairly deeply engaged in this negotiation. And behind both us and the Republican side are a pair of analytics groups who are very competent and are doing together a lot of the technical legwork to get things right and clear areas of agreement that we don't know are actually areas of agreement, and make sure that the weeds all align and work. So while the bill hasn't been filed yet on the Republican side, There's an enormous amount of technical work being done to prepare for that. And I think around the 4 Republicans are probably another 4 to 6 who are interested, curious, and watching, and could likely jump in. And there are very big industries that are winners. Steel, aluminum, cement, and pharmaceutical are all very big winners from a good carbon border tariff. So there's a lot of economic pressure and logic to getting this done, and some very powerful lobbies who could step up and push back on the fossil fuel industry and its usual desire to obstruct and impede. So I think it's really quite credible. And it also throws in the value of being able to say, hey, this is the anti-Chinese pollution fee. This is the way we get back at the Chinese for doing all this pollution. And that's an argument that I think appeals in the Republican caucus. So for a lot of reasons, the strength of the negotiations, the number of people involved, the forces who are behind it, and the strength of the analytic support, you know, the duck's feet under the water, I'm feeling pretty optimistic.
That's great to hear. And obviously there are a lot of, yeah, I won't get into them, but I know you do need to know it, like how you're going to actually, what data you're going to use, how you do emissions intensity, and so that people can feel supportive of that when they go forward. So
yeah,
I'm going to ask.
There's a lot of data out there already. You kind of just have to assimilate it. And then where there isn't enough data, you make assumptions.
Right.
And if
yeah,
people don't like the assumptions, then they got to start producing better data. So it's kind of a self-solving problem on the data front once you get moving, I think.
Yeah, that's true. And especially once you introduce some legislation, people think it's going to go someplace. People are going to come forward and make sure they get it right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we also.
That's the great thing about markets. They look ahead.
Yeah, right. And they drive ahead, right?
Yes.
So people respond to them, and businesses and corporations and et cetera. So do you have any idea when that Republican bill might be coming forward, or you don't know?
I don't know. I mean, Bill Cassidy and I first talked about it publicly at the McCain Institute Forum in Sedona over a year ago, and we talked about it again at the McCain Institute in Sedona just a few weeks ago. Right. So I don't think it's going to be another year. I think it may be a matter of weeks, probably. Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, Republicans are very cautious about touching anything that the fossil fuel industry might find distasteful. So I think they're proceeding with a lot of caution to do a lot of vetting and make sure that they're not stepping into political holes. Yeah, but, that makes sense. Yeah, and, but I think soon. Okay, great. And Cassidy's office has been very generous in briefing lots of NGOs and probably lots of other people about what they're thinking about here. So he's very able and enthusiastic. Yeah, and their staff, his staff has been great too on that. So on the just a slightly corollary thing, we just passed, thanks to your help in great part, the most aggressive climate bill ever in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act. And how do you see these two kind of fitting together or connecting, dovetailing, and why the need for this additional policy right on top of the other? How do you see those connecting? Well, first of all, we have to do more, because while this was, as the Biden administration likes to say, the biggest climate measure in history, there has been no previous climate measure in history. So to be the biggest one is not, you know, like an earth-shaking achievement. Nevertheless, it is a serious bill that does serious things, but we have to do more if we're going to get onto a path of climate safety. And one of the easiest things to do is to do a carbon border tariff, which moves international pressure onto the people who are creating the most of the pollution, solid, strong pricing pressure, the most effective kind. And they kind of supplement each other in that sense. If you think of the IRA as being a subsidy pull, the cost of a tariff would be a penalty push, and the two of them would work together quite well. There's also kind of a nice reciprocity between us and the EU here, because we went with the IRA, a big subsidies bill. The EU folks got mad and says, hey, wait a minute, you're gonna compromise our industry. This is unfair competition. And I said, you know, really tough bounce. Too bad. Pull your own socks up and do your own, make it a win-win, and quit complaining. So when the EU CBAM comes at us, they are perfectly rhetorically positioned if we start whining and complaining to say, hey, tough bounce, pull up your own socks, you can do this too, and if we had both the subsidy side and the tariff side working together, both at the EU end and at the US end, plus the social cost of carbon that the Biden administration is gently moving forward, then I think a path to climate safety begins to emerge.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. And it is for so many years, we have been talking about that we need this to be a race for the top, and the US hasn't been in the game, and we're losing all the market share, et cetera, et cetera. So this, the IRA is a step in that direction. This would be
big step,
one.
Good step.
A really good step. And this would be another one, is what I hear you saying. Can you speak a little bit about, how you think this is going to affect US jobs, since that's always like the big boogeyman on any kind of climate policy?
Yeah, that's one of the things that the technical analysts, the two firms that are supporting us, are looking at a lot, because in addition to making sure we get the carbon tariffs right and understand what the economic consequences are, we also, particularly on the Republican side, have to be able to share the economic consequences and value with their colleagues to say, hey, if we do this, it's this many jobs. One of the numbers that I've heard recently is that the effect on steel alone, if it were really efficient in terms of driving consequences, could be as many as 1 million steelworker jobs in the United States. Now, that's not going to happen. We're not going to achieve perfect efficiency. The Chinese will respond and fight to protect some of those jobs, so the whole industry just doesn't move to the US. It's not going to happen. But that's a sense of the size of the signal. And let's say we got half of that. Let's say we got a third of it. That's 330,000 steelworker jobs. That's pretty impressive stuff. And there's going to be a market for steel for a long, 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 long time. So to be making it ourselves, I think is a big advantage.
Yeah, and that, thanks for that. It really does kind of dovetail with the IRA taking this approach where the funding is going to be available to wherever business wants to develop this. So it's, such a Midwest manufacturing, wherever the steel plants are type of thing. And then this would really accelerate that. So I know they said you only had 20 minutes. So I just have one last question. And then after that, if you want to say something in closing, you can before we switch to talk to your staff lead, Matt. But one very important question I want to ask you is, your proposal puts a fee on imports, but it also has a domestic component that will require and drive down domestic US manufacturing emissions. And not all the proposals that we've seen, heard about, et cetera, have the domestic component as well. So my question to you is, how important is it in your view that any kind of border trade adjustment policy on carbon has a domestic component as well?
We began doing this when I started with my carbon pricing bill, and we realized that carbon pricing in the US would be counter-effective in a trade environment unless it had a carbon border tariff. So we've been working on this for a very, very long time in the carbon border tariff space. And we've been working very closely with former WTO officials, people who practice in front of the WTO all the time. And we feel that the safest way to assure that the border tariff is WTO compliant is to have a component of it on your own manufacturing. And what we do is we basically take the midpoint of carbon efficiency for a particular industry or a particular process and say, if you're below the midpoint, you have to pay an equivalent fee for how far you are below the midpoint. And it sets very reasonable goals because by definition, half of the industry is doing way better than you are. Yeah. So all you have to do is compete, bring yourself up to the front half of your industry. That should not be too big of an ask, but it's a triple win because it does lift us. Once we're lifted, the laggards are no longer dragging down our relative score. So it helps us in the international border and trade competition. And then obviously, if we can clear WTO, that's one less obstacle to have to wrangle about. And it all points towards lower emissions at the end of the day, which is the really sort of desperate situation that we're facing right now.
Yep. Okay, so finally, what can folks the hundreds of people that are on this webinar do to who are supportive of this? We certainly are, to try to get this to move forward, and or if you have any other additional closing remarks.
Yeah, I think it's very important to urge the Biden administration to stick to its promise that the methane regulation social cost of carbon that is baked in when it clears the Administrative Procedures Act process and becomes law, that the Office of Management and Budget requires all the other executive agencies to implement it and take direction from them about it, so that it goes executive branch wide. That's really important. Second, now that we can track methane emissions, now that we have the new methane fee, once the new methane reg is in place, enforcement becomes really, really available and important. And the Biden administration needs to put together a powerful methane enforcement task force across multiple agencies so that in real time, as they're tracking plumes from the satellite, they have lawyers headed for that location to figure out how to shut it down. And the third, I think, is just making sure that the Biden administration comes up with a person in charge and a policy so that we're meeting the EU CBAM where it is and not trying to undercut it or argue against it. And I'll close with my favorite figure, which is the zettajoule. The zettajoule is a joule of energy. It's the unit of measure. A zetta means it has 21 zeros after it. It's a really big number. The entire human consumption of energy on the planet and the whole world is half a zettajoule, so it's a really big number. But for the cost of the fossil fuel component of that energy burn of half a zettajoule, we're dumping 14 or more zettajoules of heat into the oceans every single year. So it's massively inefficient and massively harmful to the planet to be continuing to make these emissions that create hugely magnified heat effects compared to the energy value of the fuel burning itself. And, we're not going to be able to take this for longer. We got to feel the urgency.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You certainly have done and are doing every single day, everything you can to ring the bells, to tell people to wake up and to get people on the right page on this. And so it's very encouraging to talk to you about a policy that does look like it might have some bipartisan support, and having this outside force, I think, is just a kind of a unique, wonderful thing for people who, for some reason, don't want to just believe that the urgency on its own is enough to act. So
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everything you do.
Thank you.
Great.
Love to see QES. You guys are the best.
Okay, so
Thanks,
now,
Sandra.
all right, so now we're gonna have Matt come on. Matt is the climate advisor. Hi, Matt, for the Senate Budget Committee and Chairman Whitehouse. And before that, he was with the Climate Leadership Council, who's going to be his executive director, Greg Bertelsen. They've done more on this topic, I think, probably than anyone else, and is going to be on the panel coming up. So what I want to do real quickly, excuse me, I just want to see if there's a question here. I have several questions, but just a minute here. Let me just see. Okay, so here's a question from the audience, Matt. I'm just going to ask you, is it possible to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism without having domestic carbon price? If not, would you see CBAM being the entree for a domestic carbon price? That's from somebody from CCL. So I'll just ask you that question as an opening one.
That's a great question, and great to be with you, Christina. So, I mean, from technically you could do it, but at that point you're just doing tariffs. If your end goal is emissions reduction, you really do need to look at this as a global cooperation problem. The EU's put out their CBAM proposal. They've been pretty clear on what they expect other countries to do to sort of join that kind of consortium. And that does entail a domestic price. And with that domestic price, as the senator said, you get that ratcheting mechanism. So once you start this program, the sort of laggards get pushed out, and our sort of carbon efficiency, our carbon advantage in this global regime of sort of clean trade. It just gets better and better and better the more we do this. So it's not just from like a technical perspective, it's actually from an efficacy perspective that you want to submit the component as well.
Great. Okay, another question from the audience, and this is just like, I know the answer, so it'll be a quick one. So I'm going to add one onto it. This one is clarifying question. Is Senator Whitehouse working directly with Republican lawmakers on one unified CBAM bill, or how will the two come together in some kind of compromise down the road?
You know, I would sort of, I think as the senator said, we're looking and waiting eagerly to see what the Republican senators come out with, what exactly the proposal is going to be. And once that's out, we have our sort of Democratic marker bill and the Clean Competition Act. That will be the Republican marker bill. And we're going to see what we can make happen, what we can make possible.
Great. And now for a couple more technical questions about how this would work, or how you guys see that it would work. How is the emissions intensity standard calculator? How do you handle the data challenges that the senator sort of mentioned in figuring out the carbon footprint for individual products, et cetera?
So it is a challenge. I mean, I think it's, it's worth noting, I say this all the time to folks, that we should all recognize that the EU, as they rolled out their CBAM, they've had the ETS now for a decade more. They're taking the first 2 years of this program just to collect data, just to understand what the carbon footprint of various products are. And so the way we handled this in the Clean Competition Act is it's a set of defaults. So the sort of lowest level of entry is just countrywide averages. It's sort of well known, whether you're looking at, I believe OECD collects this data. There's also sort of reporting under the Paris Agreement. There's a good sense of what countrywide production emissions are, and there's a good sense of what countrywide GDP is. And from that, you can get a ratio for sort of emissions intensity by country, and you can use that to calculate what your carbon intensities are of different products, just with that sort of rough approximation. If there's better data available, like there is in the United States, you can do sector-wide, industrial sector-wide averages, where essentially you're taking all the emissions produced by facilities in that sector and dividing that by the total weight, the volume of the product produced in that sector. So you have another sort of a more accurate, more granular emissions intensity average. And then if you want even better data, if folks, firms, facilities feel like they're exceeding that performance or deserve better treatment, they can provide essentially an EPD and show that they are beating that sector-wide average because they're using some advanced technology or they're doing other things to clean up their act.
Thanks. And I think we probably only have time for one more, not because we're tired of this topic, but just because of the timing and the panel. But well, I'll ask this question, and then I also want to make sure if you think there's something else that wasn't, spelled out enough in my brief conversation with the senator for you to feel free to add that. But how does the Clean Competition Act handle exports of U.S. goods?
It's a great question. And this is actually an interesting point of difference between our proposal and the EU CBAM. We rebate exports for any sort of fee paid under this program. I mean, there's a good reason to do that. If you say, for example, follow the production pathways of like a car, like a single piece of metal could go across the US-Mexico border like 3, 4, 5 times. And so, you don't want to keep accumulating tariffs and sort of triple, quadruple, 5 times over paying for that carbon intensity every single time it comes into the US. So you need some sort of export program, export rebate in there to cover that. The EU is looking at doing something like that. Again, they're really sort of the tip of the spear on this right now. Really, I think much to our fortune because they're working out the kinks. And it's something they're looking at. They're probably going to incorporate in their proposal as well.
Is there, just before we go to the panel, is there anything else, Matt, that you wanted to, say or think needed to be clarified in this? We really appreciate your time, the senator's time, all the staff that has worked on this time.
Well, first off, thank you all for all the support and all the interest in this. It can't be said enough that us folks on the Hill really rely on the modeling, the research, the analysis frankly, sometimes just the narratives, the framings you all put out to help us explain such a complicated topic and policy better to our colleagues up here. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And sort of, as the senator said, we're very optimistic. We really think there's an opportunity for bipartisan compromise here. As we continue to push this ball down the field, please keep up the great work, keep up the analysis work. Really couldn't do it without the great thinking of you all out there supporting us.
Well, thanks. And right back at you, obviously. So, okay. So with that, thank you so much, Matt. We'll be in touch and really appreciate you participating. And now we're going to go to the second half of this program, and I'm going to go off screen and turn it over to my friend and colleague, Alden Meyer at E3G, who is going to moderate a panel on this topic. Thanks, Alden.
Well, thanks so much, Christina, and thanks for your leadership on this and leading on the board of the Pricing Carbon Initiative. That was a great conversation, both with the senator and with Matt. And we've got a wonderful panel that's going to take this forward from what we just heard. We have Greg Bertelsen, who's the CEO of the Climate Leadership Council. Christina referred to CLC, and I imagine it's one of the analytic groups that Senator Whitehouse was referring to when he said there were two analytic groups doing data work, because you've done very deep work on this. Shooting Pamerlo, who's the research manager for climate policy at the Niskanen Center, and also has done a lot of analysis and work on this topic. And Chris Kardish, who's senior manager of industrial decarbonization at C2ES, which is hosting this webinar. So Greg, I'm going to start with you. As I said, and Christina mentioned, you've done a lot of deep analysis at CLC on this. What is your top line findings on the U.S. competitive advantage when it comes to a CBAM, and what's the emission reduction proposal if something like Senator Whitehouse's CBAM proposal was enacted into law?
Thanks, Alden. Thanks to the Carbon Pricing Initiative and C2ES for hosting this really informative discussion. Really appreciated the senator's comments and Matt Bolden's to follow. I think it's really important to first acknowledge that we are really in the early days of this policy exploration. Things seem like they're moving quickly. Political momentum is perhaps picking up, but over the course of the next couple of months, I think we're going to see a few different approaches. The senator, of course, has the bill that he's working on. He alluded to the work of Senator Cassidy, and we've seen other senators discuss other approaches as well. And I think all of those, from my perspective and from a climate perspective, should be welcomed at this phase. We want to encourage this type of policy exploration. So on balance, I view these developments as quite positive from a climate standpoint. Underpinning that belief is that we need market signals throughout the global economy. And to me, that's what this discussion is all about. It's looking at a point in the global economy in which a lot of embodied emissions pass international borders, 25% or nearly thereof, nearly 25% of global emissions eventually pass through international borders. So a huge opportunity to send a market signal at a point in which many emissions ultimately flow to encourage decarbonization. But what's creating the political opportunity, Alden, is this carbon advantage, the US carbon advantage that you alluded to in your question. We've done a lot of analytical work, many others have as well, to examine the relative carbon efficiency of the US economy compared to other countries around the world. And as many on this call are aware, in most industries, compared to most, but not all countries, the United States economy is more carbon efficient. And that's where the political bipartisan opportunity sits. If we get the incentives right, we're going to not only send a powerful signal globally to encourage decarbonization, but we're going to reward those manufacturers that are operating while emitting less carbon. We're talking about setting up a new framework in which many US manufacturers have a head start. And that's the political opportunity. There's an economic win here for US interests if the policies are designed right.
Well, thanks a lot. And there's a question that's come in related to this. Obviously, by putting a price on carbon intensity of foreign imported products, whether it's steel, cement, aluminum, what have you, someone's going to pay that price. I mean, we've seen that with President Trump when he imposed tariffs on Chinese imports. He was portraying it as if that was putting a burden on China. Many US economists said, no, actually, that's putting a tax on American consumers who are buying those Chinese products. Have you or others done analysis to understand how a CBAM regime would affect consumer prices, inflation, supply chains in the US?
We have started to look at it, and just a couple of thoughts here. So first, traditional tariffs are arbitrary in nature, right? It's a rough percentage with an economic objective in mind. While the economic impacts may be beneficial to the US economy, the mechanism is an environmental based one. It's an environmental performance. It's a market based signal, which all of the organizations on this call will agree, market based signals are the most cost effective way to decarbonize. The second point, which is probably a little bit far afield from this discussion, is there's so much discussion on the Hill about diversifying our supply chains, becoming less reliant on China. All of the policies that are being explored in that space have a cost impact. This one happens to just be a really efficient way to get to the policy objectives. So we continue to analyze it. But again, the reason we support this is because of the cost efficiency of the policy and its effectiveness, ultimately at being a tool, among others, to lower global emissions.
Okay, great. Well, let's bring Shu-Ting in this conversation. And Shu-Ting, first of all, what are your thoughts in response to what the Senator and Matt said about the Clean Competition Act with a domestic performance standard, and how do you think it compares to the kind of approach Senator Cassidy's talking about, which wouldn't have a domestic performance standard or incentive for further decarbonization in the US? And can you just say a little bit about the landscape of bills and approaches we're likely to see emerging on Capitol Hill, and what the prospects might be for, as the Senator said, having a group of Republicans willing to work across the aisle on something that might actually move forward?
Yes, thank you, Alden. I would like to first thank C2ES and the Pricing Carbon Initiative for hosting this wonderful dialogue. And I also want to compliment Senator Whitehouse's work on carbon border adjustment. At the Niskanen Center, we've been working with Senator Whitehouse's office and their staffers very closely on carbon border adjustment issues. To your question, Alden, so the Clean Competition Act, as outlined by Senator Whitehouse and Matt just now, it kind of takes this approach of pairing an import tax and an export rebate with a narrow-based domestic carbon tax in the United States, levying at the facility level from a selected list of carbon-intensive industries. This is slightly different from legislation that has been introduced earlier that would be a standalone carbon border adjustment in the US without any domestic component. Yes, as the bill that's being currently working on by Senator Cassidy or Senator Kramer, some Republican offices, I'm not sure if domestic carbon price component is on their consideration. We'll have to see. I guess Senator Whitehouse just now mentioned a couple of weeks of timeline. I think regardless what will come out of the bill, the design and the structure, and I agree with Greg just now that just having this sort of conversations in the US motivated by the implementation, the EU CBAM, and also keep the conversation going of a domestic carbon tax in the United States is really positive. If you look at the laptop we're all looking at right now, or this pen I'm holding, we don't know the emissions of this specific product. We still have a long way to go. And ultimately, we really want to get to a future where we look at the supply chain, any type of product, we would easily know the emissions, and that would really inform our decarbonization strategy really well. Lastly, I want to quickly emphasize and echo Senator Whitehouse's excellent point just now in his remarks, which is it is critical to have a domestic carbon tax component to go with a carbon border adjustment because of several reasons. One, it would be administratively very easy to implement compared to not having a domestic component. And economically, it would make sense. It will help raise revenue for investing in clean technologies, rebating to households, or even help reducing the federal deficit. Legally, it would make the policy design much more likely to be compliant with WTO rules, and also it would reduce the risks of further escalating trade frictions with our trading partners.
Let me follow up on that because, I've heard some people say that we really shouldn't care how you get to the goal of reducing the carbon intensity of energy intensive products like steel, aluminum, cement, whether it's a carbon price, a cap and trade system, a set of incentives and subsidies like the Inflation Reduction Act, direct regulation of the sort that EPA is considering for power plants if they did that for the industrial sector. Any way you get there is okay. What you really ought to be comparing is the carbon intensity of the products, not the companies, the products, the specific products. Do you agree with that we ought to be looking for sort of ways to keep the eye on the intensity ball and incentives for reducing carbon intensity of products? And if so, there's a question that's come in: how do we assure the accuracy of the carbon content of imported products, and how do we assure compliance with verification and validation of those carbon content disclosures?
Yes, I would say that a standalone carbon tariff, I would like to call it a carbon tariff, a standalone policy.
Oh, I think okay, Shooting, we lost you for a minute. Can you just go back and start your answer again? Yep. You were frozen.
Sorry about that. How about right now? Can you hear me okay?
Good. Yep, good.
Awesome. So I was saying that I'm not sure a standalone carbon border adjustment or carbon tariff without a domestic carbon tax would necessarily achieve the intended goal of incentivizing our trading partners to reduce emissions. It will increase prices, basically have the equivalent effects of the import tariff. It increase consumer prices, someone have to pay for that. It would protect certain industries and jobs at the cost of some other industries and jobs. And also, if we just put a polluter fee on the imported products without domestic component or export rebate, I'm not sure how we can further incentivize domestic manufacturers to further decarbonize. So with that said, I think that we should also look at the cost efficiency side of a carbon tax versus massive tax subsidies and regulations. With a carbon tax, it would be technology neutral. We don't have to pick winners and losers across industries. It would be much broader across the economy. It would be quicker, much more efficient, would allow companies the flexibility to find the most efficient and least costly way to reduce emissions. In terms of your question, Alden, how to really measure, audit, and verify emissions at the product level for the implementation of carbon border adjustment, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the implementation of the EU CBAM. When they start collecting data from October this year, all the way into 2026, before the actual collection of import fees, they will have a massive data portal of a lot of industry. And we're talking about not industry data, but product level. The steel, we're talking about sheets of steel, steel raw, steel sticks. I'm making product names up now. The emissions associated with those, and that's going to be exciting, and it's going to be transforming and very meaningful and significant for the decarbonization cause we're all in.
Great, thanks a lot. And I know this weekend at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, the G7 leaders are going to be putting out a clean energy economy action plan, which among other things is going to ask the OECD to report back to them on what they're learning about some of these data issues in their inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches. But Chris, let me bring you in. As I said, you're a senior manager of industrial decarbonization at C2ES, and I know from years of working with Nat and Kaveh and Jenny and others at C2ES that you do a lot in the international space. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about how the EU CBAM and a possible US CBAM that of the kind that Senator Whitehouse was talking about could provide incentives to actually build partnerships or carbon clubs or climate clubs with some of the major emerging economies, rather than getting us into a sort of protectionist trade war kind of stance. And I do note that just I think yesterday, India filed a case against the EU CBAM at the World Trade Organization. So we already see a little bit of saber rattling from some of the potential targets of an EU CBAM, and some of those would be affected as well by a US CBAM. Can you just talk about sort of incentives and disincentives for international collaboration with this policy?
Sure. Thanks, Alden. And just want to also thank Senator Whitehouse for his leadership on this issue, and the Pricing Carbon Initiative folks for spearheading this event. So I think one of the attractive things about, maybe to go back to Senator Whitehouse's proposal and the fact that it includes a domestic component, is that I think the inclusion of that actually does make it more likely to build, to mobilize trading partners around a common approach. The effectiveness of these policies, which are sort of narrowly touch, a handful of industrial commodities, maybe a bit beyond that later, they're always going to be relatively narrow unless we can build global cooperation. And I think what's also interesting about, well, both Senator Whitehouse's policy and what we might see from Senator Cassidy is an approach to go beyond that in a way that's potentially even more compatible to a global regime than the European Union's approach, which is of course quite prescriptive in the way that it singles out carbon pricing as essentially the main means of reducing compliance obligations. Senator Cassidy's approach is likely to attempt to mobilize trading partners around an emissions performance approach that is a bit more agnostic to the precise policy. I think Senator Whitehouse's approach is also conducive to that kind of cooperation. And I think that's one of the things that makes it quite compelling. And I think whatever we see coming out of the Senate is likely to be conducive to international cooperation around an emissions performance-based approach that is largely policy agnostic.
Okay, great. And I know the C2ES has a business leadership council with a number of major Fortune 500 companies, part of it spanning a range of sectors. Has this been discussed with your business leadership council, and is there sort of a unified position around CBAMs, or is there a diversity of reactions and sort of stances on it at this point?
That's a good question. So I mean, I don't think that there is a unified response. I think that there's increasing interest and a desire to understand both approaches that we're likely to see from both parties. I think that in general, our Business Environmental Leadership Council is a group that is more supportive of market-based measures. So on the whole, that's a group where we're likely to see a strong basis of support for policies like a border adjustment. But I can't say that we've coalesced around, say, a particular approach at this stage.
Okay.
And there's likely to also be strong support for something that includes a domestic component.
Well, let me throw this open to all of you and sort of build on that. Senator Whitehouse talked about how this would have a tremendous advantage for US Steel, aluminum, other companies, and Greg, I think some of your analysis shows that. He sort of posited that this would negatively affect the fossil fuel industry and they could be expected to oppose it, or at least some of them could. And I'm wondering, are there other players in this space that are likely to engage? I mean, for example, users of imported steel or other products, car manufacturers, other manufacturers, will they decide they've got a dog in this fight and weigh in on a hill, or is it primarily between the US energy intensive trade exposed industries and the fossil fuel company? Anyone want to jump in on that one? Greg, I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that one. So I just want to come back to my first comment, which is that I believe we're still in the relatively early days, and that does not just mean in Congress. It also means the discussions that are happening within the business community. To Chris's point, there is not one position, and I think I don't think you can paint any one industry into one position on this or another, in part because the policy details matter greatly. And I'll just give you an example using the fossil fuel industry as the example. Let's remember that Senator Kramer, who is very clearly publicly expressed interest in this, when he first put out anything public, it was in an op-ed with H.R. McMaster, talking about how the US and EU could come together to form some kind of an arrangement. And the hook in this op-ed was to de-leverage Russia. This was pre-invasion, because by most calculations, US natural gas is less methane intensive in its production than Russian gas. And so again, the details matter greatly in terms of where industry ultimately will land in terms of their support. And I think that same point can be said for steel down to more complex goods, the automobile manufacturers. It's all going to come down to the policy details.
Shu-Ting or Chris, do you want to come in on this, on sort of the broader industry landscape? Any thoughts on that, or maybe even more sort of what the outlook might be for this going forward? Is this something we could see momentum on maybe in this session of Congress? Does it matter what the administration does? Senator Whitehouse seemed to think it would be nice if they did something, but they don't totally have their act together. It's the way I read his remarks, and it doesn't really matter that much if they don't weigh in. But what are your views on that, the landscape and the importance of the administration engaging?
Yeah, I thank you for your questions, Alden. To address your first question about the potential coverage of products under a carbon border adjustment, I think the EU Parliament has signaled that they would be interested in broadening the coverage of the products of the EU CBAM from the current list of 6 sectors to more goods, potentially to all the sectors and products currently covered under the ETS. I would say that even for the industries and corporations that are not carbon intensive or trade exposed, it's probably a very good idea for them to start thinking about mapping out their carbon footprint, setting any internal carbon emission or decarbonization targets if they haven't already, and thinking about third-party partners on emissions measuring and auditing and reporting. You made an excellent point, Alden, like we look at steel, but steel is in a lot of products in our life, car, automobile, a lot of stuff, and it wouldn't make sense to just border adjust steel, but not all the other products that are made out of steel. So I think I'm optimistic, like eventually we'll get to a broad-based border adjusted carbon tax. So I think now is a really good time to start thinking about, from an industry perspective, how to measure the emissions. In terms of the administration's involvement in this space, I think it will be very interested to keep a close eye on the US-EU steel and aluminum trade deal that was passed a while ago, and see if they have any developments on that front, any other countries that will be joining, or if they will make any progress on the harmonization between the EU and the US on data measuring for emissions reduction. I participated in some conferences over the last few weeks, and one reoccurring theme I've heard from corporate executives is that we don't want to deal with two set of standards and measuring processes in the EU and US if we're going to do this. It would be ideal if the EU and the US could come to a table and agree on some sort of standards and processes to really measure and verify the emissions. And I think it would also be interested to see if the trade chief of the Catherine Tai of the Biden administration would take any further steps in terms of addressing climate change in international trade.
Thanks, Shuting. And Chris, over to you for your reactions and sort of closing thoughts on this. We're coming up on time in a couple of minutes. So is there anything you want to add on any of these questions?
Sure. I very much agree with Shuting that, some of the best ways the Biden administration can engage on this issue is through that potential agreement on aluminum and steel. I think, it's sometimes tempting to think about responses, say, through Section 232, which has sort of been widely used in the past. And I think that I don't know that the Biden administration is necessarily thinking about that along those lines, but I also think that that's probably a blunt instrument, whereas we probably need something that is durable, nuanced, and likely a legislative response, and ideally a bipartisan legislative response. And that's probably the best possible thing we can do. But maybe it's just sort of parting thoughts as we're closing down here is I think just would love to both sort of urge, continued consideration in Congress on this. I think it's great that to echo Greg, that we have both parties coming up with good faith efforts to design good policies that can reduce emissions globally, and would encourage them to consider the possibility of a domestic component that can both sort of further leverage investments in the IRA to continue sort of boosting the carbon advantage that CLC has done so much work to popularize, while also probably motivating our trading partners to join some kind of regime like that, because in the absence of a domestic component, it's going to be a lot harder to mobilize our allies to join any sort of club-like effort.
Well, thanks so much to all three of you and to C2ES for sponsoring this, to the Pricing Carbon Initiative for organizing it, to Christina for running a wonderful conversation, both with Senator Whitehouse and with Matt. This has been fascinating. Time is way too short. We've only scratched the surface, but the good news is I think we'll have a little more time before anything gets to President Biden's desk to continue this conversation down the road. So everyone, please stay tuned. This recording will be available after we finish, and we will keep you apprised of future events in this series. So thank you, Nat. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Shuting. Thanks to all the people behind the scenes that made this webinar so seamless. And let's keep following this issue and see what we can do to help Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cassidy, others that are trying to push for a more rational US climate policy. Thanks a lot, everyone.